All right, welcome to part 3 of this introductory lecture in regards to church history. We've talked about how our relationship to the dead has changed, and we've also talked about how our relationship to measuring time and time has also changed, and both of those have affected the way in which we think about the past. Now I want to talk about memory. Who are you when you start forgetting who you are? Right? Uh, are there consequences to forgetfulness? When you start forgetting about your story or are unable to tell your story, as many of us will have experienced with loved ones who have suffered with dementia and Alzheimer's, what happens there? Right? One of the interesting questions is who do you become when you no longer are able to know who you are, when you're no longer able to tell your story? Even the way in which I phrase that question reveals some of the issues, right? Because some of the issues are, it's about me, how I think about memory. So for many of us, memory is a brain thing. It's an individual thing. It's a neurological issue. All right. And so when you're trying to remember something, in particular, a lot of times you can try and get into your brain. That's where memory is housed. But memory is much more complicated than that. And our view of memory only being kind of neurological is problematic. Just recently, there's been a somewhat movement for treatment centers for people with dementia to create model towns. In San Diego, a model town of the 1950s was produced. Okay, the idea was that if you create these kind of era little Disneyland-esque types of places, people could live with their long-term memory and act and interact and engage in different ways. Now, part of that is true and helpful, but part of that is also problematic, because one of the things that memory and emotions act differently. So, for instance, if we took Grandma Betty to this 1950s San Diego downtown, and there she saw this 1956 red Chevy go across, and that 1956 red Chevy was the same one that her uncle Bobby owned, and Bobby abused her. Now, so that might take her back to a time where she's kind of cognizant and able to function to a higher degree than maybe in the 2020s. But that emotional connection to that memory gets triggered. Now, you take her back home, that memory is gone, but the emotion stays there, right? Because emotions don't shut off and on. And so now she is experiencing trauma, but she doesn't even know why she's experiencing some kind of trauma or anger or angst. So there's consequences even with playing around with these types of kind of artificial creation of time and space to help people with Alzheimer's cope. The question, who will I be when I do not remember who I am, is a powerful question, as I mentioned earlier. In part because it values our autonomy, our ability to remember. And that's a lot of what our society values. So when we start losing those things, this question is really haunting. Right? If I can't remember my name, I can't remember my place, my time, who am I? Right? And this is really haunting and a tragic experience for many of us who've had loved ones go through the process of dementia. So how do we maybe think better about these types of things? I think it's important to kind of understand that there's collective memory, and that remembering is work. All right, remembering is maybe a little bit different than memory, but remembering is tied to memory. And throughout the Old Testament and our scriptures, we are called to remember. To remember. And that work of remembering takes effort. It's not just our brains have memories. No, we have to work at remembering. John Swinton, in his book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God, says this: our memories aren't simply in our heads or in our brains, they're scattered in many places. Memory that is in a real sense ours clearly exists both inside and outside of individual brains. The memory of God is, of course, one place where such memory exists and is sustained. But it exists in other places, places that we hardly notice or simply take for granted. Every time we take notes at a lecture or write down a shopping list, we're grafting in external aspects of our memory. Even within our constructions of our identities, it's often the memory of others that helps us to have memories of ourselves, like stories from grandparents, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. When I think back on my past, I remember some things about what I once was and where I've been. But my mother remembers other things that I don't recall. When she tells them to me, I graft them into my story, and eventually they become part of my memory system. My point is, this is Swinton speaking, my point is that even in normal times, some of our memories are outside ourselves and often stored and told by others around us. And when some things about ourselves are far from clear in our own minds, we are able to experience a sense of self through the memories of us held by those around us, through the stories they tell about us. Memory, like mind and personhood, is corporate through and through. So we have to kind of shift our idea of memory as kind of neurological, autonomous, and individual. And what he's calling us is to a collective memory and the work of remembering. Now for the church, the work of remembering is really important. He says, this is John Swinton again, he says, we Christians are therefore called to be attentive to the presence of God in others. The memory of God creates a community of remembering that is called to learn what it means to be attentive to God in those for whom memory is no longer their defining feature or primary learning experience. As we realize that we are remembered, we are freed to remember well. As we begin to forget, so others bear the weight of remembering for us. A form of remembrance that calls for quite specific forms of loving action. I'm going to show you this image of a video of this woman who works with patients with severe dementia. And what it will do, hopefully, is show you the way in which remembering demands attentiveness. If we think about time, it demands the speed of love, which is 3 miles an hour, which demands your attention. You can't walk quickly. You can't move quickly through the work of remembering. So let me show this video for you. Okay.
Hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who is in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech, but they have human needs that need to be expressed. You're crying. You're crying. You have a tear right here in your face. You have a little pain. You don't want me to touch you. You're very sad. Can you see me? Is it scary? Are you afraid? And if this person sits with their eyes closed, rocking back and forth, and maybe there's a tear coming down, there's a need there. Here. There's a little tear that's coming out. Do you feel it? You feel a little tear? If you gently use touch, and I touched Gladys Wilson for the fingertips right here on the cheek, is where the mother usually touches a child. If you touch an infant there, it looks up, and every cell remembers where it was touched by the mother. And often that person knows, even if they can't say a word at that moment, they won't talk, or they don't want to talk, but there's a communication. And that person is no longer alone. Can you let me in a little bit? You think? Just a little? You think I could be with you and Jesus for a minute? Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. I used music, because when speech is gone, music, especially with Gladys Wilson, it was religious music, because there's emotion tied to it and safety tied to it. So I used her old church songs. Jesus loves me, yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so. He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hand. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. The breakthrough doesn't happen every time. The person will not always open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying and you keep centering yourself and really look at that person and really mirror their movements, maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. You feel safe. You feel safe? Yeah. With Jesus? Yeah. And me?
So here you can see this work of remembering, this beautiful act of attention, of love that Gladys experiences. This is the type of work of remembering that we're called to. A different kind of view of memory that's collective that we're exploring. The importance in John Swinton's book Dementia highlights the idea of God's memory and what it means to live in the memory of God. He says that God's memory is a sustaining memory. In this book, he talks about if God remembers us, we are provided with a source of deep and enduring hope. We are not what we remember, we are remembered. And so memory is first and foremost something that is done for us rather than something we achieve on our own. Now, participating in the work of remembering, then, is participating in the work of God who remembers. And so, what I want us to do is think about a different way of memory, that it's more collective, more theological, than when we think about kind of memory just solely being autonomous and kind of neurological, individual. Because I think that also shapes our understanding of the past and what we value worth remembering at all. And so I'll end this portion, this part of the lecture, and then the fourth part, you'll be able to catch up on that next. So I'll go here, and we'll see you back for the next part.